Private Room 101, autumn of 1974. The hallway of the St. Jude's Hospice smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial-grade bleach, a scent that always seemed to coat the back of my throat like a thin layer of oil. My shoes made a rhythmic, sticky sound against the linoleum, a dull thud click that echoed off the pale green walls. I had been called to many deathbeds, but Room 101 felt different before I even crossed the threshold. The air around the doorframe felt heavy, static, like the moments right before a summer thunderstorm breaks the heat. I pushed the door open, and the hinges gave a high, thin whine, a sound like a small animal in pain. Inside, the light was filtered through heavy velvet curtains that had been pulled tight, leaving only a sliver of the gray October afternoon to slice across the floorboards. In the center of that gloom lay a man who had once commanded boards of directors and shifted the fate of national economies with a single stroke of a fountain pen. Mr. Sterling did not look like a titan of industry. He looked like a collection of sticks wrapped in expensive dyeing silk. The rustle of his silk pajamas as he shifted was a dry, papery sound, reminding me of dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. His breathing was a wet, mechanical struggle, timed perfectly to the rhythmic wheeze of the bellows in the corner. I sat down in the wooden chair beside his bed, and the old timber groaned under my weight, a tired protest that filled the silence. He didn't look at me at first. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, tracing patterns in the cracked plaster that only he could see. His right hand was clenched tight around a gold pocket watch. It wasn't the ticking of the watch that I heard. The watch was silent. It was the sound of his fingernails scratching against the polished metal, a frantic, rhythmic scraping that set my teeth on edge. "Chaplain," he whispered. His voice was a jagged ruin, a sound of dry earth shifting in a deep well. He didn't turn his head. He just kept scratching that gold. "They say you are a man who knows how to bury things. Not bodies, no, souls. You bury the things that people can't carry into the dirt with them." I felt a cold shiver trace a path down my spine, a finger of ice resting on my neck. I opened my leather journal, the familiar scent of old paper and ink rising to meet me. But for the first time in years, I found my hands were shaking. I wasn't just a priest that day. I was a witness to a collapse. I told him I was there to listen, but the silence that followed was so thick I could almost taste the dust in it. I remember the way the heart monitor beeped, a sharp electronic chirp that felt violent in such a fragile room. Every beat seemed to mock the man in the bed. He finally turned his head, and the way his neck tendons strained under his translucent skin made me want to look away. His eyes were terrifying. They weren't the eyes of a man seeking God. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of a very dark pit and realized he was the one who dug it. He held up the watch. The gold caught the sliver of afternoon light, reflecting a jagged yellow tooth onto the wall. "This watch," he said, and I could hear the phlegm rattling in his chest with every word. "This watch was a gift from a town that no longer exists. They gave it to me because they thought I was their savior. They thought the dam I was building would bring light to their valley. Instead, I brought the dark." I watched a single bead of sweat roll down his temple, disappearing into the collar of his silk pajamas. He began to tell me about a place called Blackwood Valley. He spoke of the way the mist used to sit in the trees at dawn, a soft white blanket that smelled of pine and damp earth. He described the sound of the church bells on Sundays, a silver ringing that could be heard for miles. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, fueled by a frantic, desperate energy. He told me about the night the sirens didn't scream. He told me about the structural reports he had burned in his fireplace while drinking a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He described the feeling of the heat from the flames on his face as he watched the engineers' warnings turn to gray ash. He was talking about a massacre hidden under the guise of progress, a village wiped off the map, not by an act of God, but by an act of greed. I leaned forward, the smell of his decay and expensive cologne mixing in the stagnant air. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I thought of the families, the children who went to sleep in Blackwood Valley thinking the morning would come. I looked at his skeletal hands, the same hands that had signed the orders to open the floodgates prematurely to save a few million in insurance premiums. The room felt smaller then. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, reaching toward the bed. I wondered how many people had been silenced by the weight of the water he had unleashed. I wondered if the gold in his hand was actually made from the wedding rings of the drowned. I felt a wave of revulsion, a physical need to stand up and walk out into the cold rain. But I stayed. I was the chaplain. I was the one who had to hold the mirror up to the monster. He stopped talking for a moment, and the only sound was the wind rattling the window pane in its frame, a hollow, lonely sound. He looked at me, and for a split second I saw a flash of the boy he had once been, buried under 80 years of sin. Why is it that we only seek the light when the darkness has finally caught up to us? The hum of the oxygen machine in room 101 was a low, constant drone, a mechanical heartbeat that felt like it was counting down the seconds of a life bought with blood. Outside, the wind whipped a branch against the window pane, a sharp, skeletal tapping that sounded like someone or something was trying to get in. I shifted in my chair, the old wood letting out a long, slow moan that seemed to echo the groan in my own chest. I looked down at the gold watch in his skeletal hand, the metal reflecting a dull, sickly light. It was a heavy thing, far too heavy for a man whose bones looked like they were made of dry parchment. He started to tell me about the summer of 1952. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the deep shadows of the ceiling. The rain that year, he whispered, and I had to lean in so close I could smell the stale, medicinal scent of his breath. The rain didn't fall, it descended. It was a solid wall of gray that turned the soil of the valley into a thick, hungry soup. I was 30 then. I was a man who believed that gravity and concrete were the only gods worth worshipping. I was the lead architect of the Blackwood Dam, and I knew the foundation was resting on a bed of shale that was as stable as wet sugar. I watched a single, large tear track a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek, getting lost in the folds of his translucent skin. He didn't wipe it away. His hands were too busy clawing at that watch. He told me about the board meeting 3 nights before the dam broke. He described the smell of expensive tobacco and the taste of the cold amber whiskey as he lied to the investors. He told them the dam was a fortress. He told them the village below was safer than a child in a cradle. But in his pocket his fingers were tracing the edges of a report that said the concrete was already spiderwebbing with cracks. The sound of the rain outside the hospital seemed to intensify as he spoke, a rhythmic drumming that felt like 1,000 tiny hammers hitting the glass. He described the night of the breach. It wasn't a roar at first, he said. It was a sigh, a long, weary sigh as the earth simply gave up. He was standing on the observation deck, wrapped in a heavy wool coat that cost more than most of the villagers made in a year. He heard the first crack, a sound like a gunshot echoing through the canyon, and then the silence, the most terrifying silence I have ever known. The sirens were supposed to scream, "Chaplain." I had designed them to wake the dead. but the wiring had been stripped to save costs. The alarms remained as mute as the graves they were about to fill. I felt a cold, physical weight settle in the pit of my stomach. I reached out to touch the black leather of my journal, seeking some kind of anchor in the sea of his depravity. My fingers traced the worn grain of the cover, a tactile reminder of my own reality. I thought of the village, the baker who would have been prepping the morning dough, the mothers tucking their children into beds that would soon become their coffins. I could almost hear the water, a dark, churning wall of debris and ice-cold fury sweeping through the narrow streets of the valley. He laughed then, a dry rattling sound that turned into a wet cough. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated bitterness. "They gave me this watch a month after the accident," he said, his voice trembling with a horrific kind of irony. A group of survivors pooled what little they had left to thank the man who had tried so hard to save them. They didn't know I was the one who had pulled the plug. They didn't know that their grief was my profit margin. I took the watch. I took it, and I wore it every single day, listening to a tick that sounded like a heart stopping. I looked at him, at this 82-year-old male, extremely gaunt with translucent pale skin, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite hate. It was a profound, hollow exhaustion. I was the one who had to hear this. I was the one who had to carry the image of those sunken rooftops and the mud-caked toys floating in the reservoir. The secret wasn't just his anymore. It was mine. It was a poison he was pouring into my ears, one drop at a time, making sure I would be the one to choke on it after he was gone. The nurse entered the room then, her starch-white uniform rustling with a crisp, clean sound that felt like a slap in the face. She checked the IV drip, her movements efficient and cold. She didn't look at the man in the bed. She looked at the machines. In this room, the human being had already been replaced by the data points of his decline. When she left, the silence that rushed back in was even heavier than before. It felt like the water was rising in the room, a slow, invisible flood that was pressing against my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. Sterling gripped my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man. His skeletal fingers felt like cold iron bands. "You have to tell them," he hissed, his sunken sockets burning with a frantic, dying light. "You have to tell them where the records are. They're under the floorboards of the old gatehouse. The truth is buried under 6 inches of oak and 40 feet of water. I can't go into the dark with this watch still ticking, Chaplain. I can't." I pulled my hand away, the skin where he touched me feeling cold and tainted. I looked at the gold watch, now lying on the pale blue silk of his pajamas. It looked like an eye, unblinking and judgmental. I wondered how many secrets are held in the quiet of the night, whispered to men like me who can never repeat them. I wondered if the weight of a secret is measured by the lives it cost or the years it was kept. If a man builds a throne out of the headstones of the innocent, is he a king, or is he just the tallest ghost in the graveyard? Private Room 101, the final hour. The rain had turned from a rhythmic drumming into a violent, chaotic lashing against the glass, a sound like 1,000 panicked hands clawing to get inside the warmth of the hospital. I could feel the cold seeping through the window frame, a thin, icy draft that smelled of wet pavement and ozone. Mr. Sterling's breathing had changed. It was no longer a struggle, it was a surrender. The wet, rattling sound in his chest, the death rattle, as the nurses called it, was the only thing filling the silence of the room, timed to the jagged, green pulse of the monitor that was growing slower with every passing second. He reached out one last time, his skeletal fingers brushing against the sleeve of my charcoal gray wool cardigan. His touch was barely there, a ghost of a sensation, but it felt as heavy as a mountain. Chaplain, he wheezed, and his eyes, those sunken burning pits, found mine for the final time. The watch, it's not just gold, it's the anchor. If you keep it, you keep them. If you throw it away, they stay under the water forever. You decide who gets to breathe and who stays drowned. I looked at the gold watch lying on the bed. It was a beautiful, cursed thing. The light from the hallway caught the cracks in its crystal face, creating a spiderweb of shadows across the pale blue silk of his pajamas. I realized then that he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for a partner in his crime. He didn't want to be the only one who remembered the screams of Blackwood Valley. He wanted to hand me the keys to a cemetery and walk away into the white light, leaving me to guard the gates. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of anger, a heat that started in my chest and rose to my throat. I am a man of God, a man who has spent his life trying to bring light into the darkest corners of the human heart. But in that moment, I wanted to take that watch and crush it under my heel. I thought of the village, the names he had never mentioned, the faces that had been erased from the earth because he wanted his profit margins to stay black. I thought of the silence he had bought with his millions, a silence that was now sitting in my lap like a lead weight. The monitor gave a long, high-pitched whine, a single, flat tone that signaled the end of the titan of industry. The sound was deafening in the small room. It didn't sound like a tragedy. It sounded like a machine finally giving up on a bad job. I didn't move. I sat there in the wooden chair, listening to that electronic scream, my hands gripped so tightly around my black leather journal that my knuckles turned white. The smell of the room changed almost instantly, the sharp scent of bleach being replaced by a heavy, stagnant stillness. I looked at his face. The tension had left his features, and for a moment he looked almost peaceful. It was the most offensive thing I had ever seen. A man who had drowned a valley shouldn't be allowed to look like he was sleeping. I reached out and took the gold watch. It was still warm from his hand, a sickening borrowed heat that made my skin crawl. I tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan, the weight of it pulling the wool down, a physical reminder of the burden I had just accepted. I walked out of room 101, my shoes silent on the linoleum this time, as if I were moving through a dream. I didn't speak to the nurse with the auburn hair as I passed the station. I didn't look back at the door. I walked straight out into the October night, letting the freezing rain soak through my clothes and run down my neck. I stood there under a street lamp, the yellow light making the raindrops look like falling sparks. I pulled the watch out and looked at it. I thought about the gatehouse he had mentioned. I thought about the floorboards and the water-damaged records that held the truth of a massacre. I had a choice to make. I could take this watch to the authorities, open the floodgates of a different kind, and watch as his legacy was torn to pieces. I could bring justice to the families of Blackwood Valley, decades too late. Or I could do what Sterling had done. I could bury the secret. I could protect the peace of the valley that had grown over the ruins, ensuring that the descendants of the survivors never had to know that their history was built on a lie. I looked at my hands, the large, trembling hands of an old man who had seen too much. I realized that the inheritance he left me wasn't the gold. It was the power to play God. It was the same intoxication that had led him to burn those reports in 1952. The rain was washing away the scent of the hospital, but it couldn't wash away the feeling of that watch in my palm. It felt like a heart, still ticking, still demanding to be heard. I still see his face when I close my eyes. Not the face of the dying man, but the face of the man he described, the one standing on the dam, watching the world end and doing nothing. I carry that watch in my desk drawer now, I never wound it. I never polished it. It sits there in the dark, a golden ghost that whispers to me in the middle of the night. Every time I think I've found peace, I hear that phantom tick, a reminder that some secrets don't stay buried, no matter how much water you pour over them. I did what I thought was right, but as I sit here now with the winter of my own life closing in, I wonder if I simply became the last brick in his dam. I wonder if by keeping the silence, I became the very thing I spent my life trying to save people from. The weight of the truth is heavy, but the weight of a lie is a burden that grows with every breath you take. If you had the power to heal a wound by revealing a scar that would break 1,000 hearts, would you pick up the scalpel, or would you let the wound rot in the dark?